At Restore Community Church, the church that I'm a part of, we'll be focusing on Paul's letter to the Philippians over the next 5 weeks or so. Hence a series of talks on the subject. Now, this will be an introduction to the Philippians. The Bible is essentially a library of many books. It's divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, the New Testament has 27 books. The first 4 of them are called the Gospels, where they give an account of the life of Christ, his birth, his miracles, his death, his resurrection. And then there are 21 letters which basically explain how we can apply the principles of the life of Christ as followers of Jesus. Then there's one historical book and there's one prophetic book. Now, the Philippians is one of the 21 letters. And Philippians is known as a friendship letter because Paul is writing to his friends and his supporters, and the whole book rings with joy and gratitude. It's the only one of Paul's letters that has no reprimand or rebuke. It's filled with affirmation and encouragement. The major theme of Philippians is joy. Joy in Jesus, overcoming joy. Now, this is remarkable because Paul is writing this letter basically from prison. He's under house arrest in Rome, awaiting trial. In Acts 16, we read of Paul and Silas and Timothy traveling on what is effectively known as Paul's second missionary journey. And one night, Paul has a vision. He sees a man in the Greek province of Macedonia calling them, come over and help us. That's known as Paul's Macedonian Call. The next day, Paul and his team make plans to go across to Macedonia and effectively plant the first church in Europe in Philippi. Now, in 1974, almost to the day, Cecilia and I were in Philippi. It was part of our missionary training program. We were on a Middle East field trip. We'd already been to Rome, where we read the letter to the Romans. We'd been in Thessaloniki, where we did the same. And yeah, we were in Philippi. You can see my Bible of those days, Philippians, and there's an annotation, visited Philippi the 4th of May, 1974, Paul's first church established in Europe. We then went on to go to Turkey, where we visited the 7 churches of Revelations. We were in Israel for a week, where we studied the discipleship principles and the leadership methods of Jesus. Now, that experience, being in those nations, seeing the needs of those nations, became our Macedonian call to get involved in the nations of the world and to take the love of God to the nations and the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ to the nations. Now, 45 years later, we are just as passionate and just as eager to get to know God more intimately and to make God known amongst the nations of the earth. Now back to Philippi. Philippi was named after Philip of Macedon. He was a king of Macedonia, and he was also the father of Alexander the Great. Philippi was a port city. It was on the Mediterranean. It was a booming metropolis. It was very secular. It was a Roman colony and very hostile to Christianity. And it's in that environment that Paul went to plant a church. Now, when Paul writes this joy-filled letter to his friends and supporters, he does so first of all to thank them for their support, and especially for the money they've been sending to defray his expenses as he's awaiting trial. He also writes to warn them against false teaching, and then he writes to urge them to greater unity amongst themselves. In chapter 4, verse 4, Paul says this: "Rejoice in the Lord always. Let me say it again, rejoice." And then Paul points out that there's nothing that can stamp out the joy of Jesus in us. Each chapter in this letter just underlines and emphasizes these timeless truths. In chapter 1, he talks about living in the joy of the Lord amongst painful conflict. Secondly, the joy of serving with a spirit of humility. In chapter 3, he talks about the joy of knowing Jesus intimately and making the incomparable blessings of Jesus known to others. And in chapter 4, he talks about the joy of walking in contentment and in gratitude. Tucked away in this joy-filled letter that Paul writes to his friends and supporters, he reveals the driving ambition of his life. Even after 2 decades in ministry, Paul passionately declares in chapter 3, verse 10, I want to know Christ. I want to know Christ. In his unsatiable hunger for God, he has this growing passion to grow in intimacy with God. A desire he hopes will ignite the heart of every believer. May that ignite our hearts, that we be passionate, that we'd be hungry and yearning for a greater intimacy with God, so that we can also cry out with Paul, as he did in chapter 1, verse 21, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Until next time, God bless you.